As you probably haven't been able to avoid noticing, 2016 is this 300th anniversary of the birth of Lancelot Capability Brown, the best known of all Britain's landscape gardeners. And the celebrations have already begun, and Brown now has his own website, appropriately for the modern age. Brown is justly celebrated. He transformed the English countryside in a way that has endured for over 250 years. His style of gardening has even been claimed to be England's greatest contribution to European culture. Shakespeare might dissent, but that's up to you to decide. But Brown wasn't only a great designer, he was also a very successful entrepreneur. And I want to concentrate today on that aspect of his life and career. Just as Brown was among a large number of garden designers, many of them, most of them, much less well known than him, he was also one among many gardening entrepreneurs. And we can only best assess his achievements by comparing him with others and by exploring the times within which they built their gardens and their businesses. So I'm going to compare and contrast Brown with one of his predecessors, Henry Wise, and one of his successors, Joseph Paxton. Wise and Paxton are well known to all garden historians, but otherwise they're much less familiar than Brown to a wider public. So let me begin by giving a brief sketch of the careers of each of them, and start with Henry Wise. Wise was born in 1653, as you can see. The Dictionary of National Biography says that his family came from Oxfordshire, but he was baptised on the 4th of September 1653 at St Alphege in Greenwich. Little is known about his early career, but he was certainly apprenticed to or worked with George London, who was gardener first to Henry Compton, Bishop of London, a very important figure in gardening history, and then to William III and Queen Mary. London was one of the founding partners of what became the great Brompton Park nursery. And in 1687, he invited Wise to become a partner in the nursery. And Wise worked with London on the royal gardens, beginning in 1691 with the grounds of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. That, of course, is now the site of that emblem of modern British gardening, the Chelsea Flower Show. In 1702, on the accession of Queen Anne, Wise became the royal gardener. And he held that post for the whole of Anne's reign, and then also from 1714 to 1727 under George I. In addition to the royal gardens, he was responsible with Vanbrugh for the enormous garden landscapes of Blenheim Palace, as well as for other gardens around the country, such as that great garden at Melbourne in Derbyshire. But his career as a businessman was centred around Brompton Park. This nursery is said to have occupied between 50 and 100 acres of the land that's now covered by the South Kensington Museums and Imperial College. Like many estimates of that kind, one has to take it slightly with a pinch of salt. This plan, although it's of unknown date, actually shows an area of about 16.2 acres. But in 1702, it was estimated, perhaps with greater accuracy, to have nearly 10 million plants on sale. And one of them, familiar to many gardeners, is the Brompton stocks, or Gillyflowers, bred apparently at the Brompton Park nursery and still available today. Many of the plants were supplied to the royal gardens, where Wise held the contract for the maintenance of those gardens. He also separately contracted, I'll come back to that, for huge garden works at Hampton Court and the other palaces. And in 1709, his success enabled Wise to buy his own estate at the Priory in Warwick. And he retired there in 1727 and created formal gardens on what is now Priory Park, Warwick. The Priory, which is originally a Tudor house built on the site of a 12th century priory, was dismantled in the 1920s. It was rescued by an American millionaire, and if you go to Richmond, Virginia, you can see a somewhat altered version of it re-erected there. So it's not in Warwick, but in Richmond. Wise died in 1737 and was then said to be worth £200,000, although his biographer prefers the safer figure of £100,000. I'll come back to what those sums mean a bit later on. But let me move on to my second of the trio, Lancelot Brown. He was baptised on the 30th of August 1716 at Kirk Hall in Northumberland. There are various fanciful stories about his birth, but he seems prosaically to have been the fifth child of William Brown, a farmer and land agent to Sir William Lorraine. Something unusual about him is that he stayed at school until the age of 16, but he certainly then began work for Lorraine at Kirk Hall as a gardener. We don't know where he was between 1739, when he left Kirk Hall, and 1741, but it seems likely that for at least some of this time he was learning hydraulic engineering, a very important skill for landscape designers, in Lincolnshire. He certainly met a Lincolnshire girl, and he married her in 1744. By 1740 or 1741, however, he was in Oxfordshire, and it's said that the first piece of water he formed was at Lady Mostyn's at Kiddington. This is the lake. The house is actually later, and it's a country house now owned by Jemima Khan. He also worked at Grimsthorpe in Lincolnshire, where there are extensive lakes and waterworks. It was probably, however, at Kiddington in Oxfordshire that Brown attracted the attention of Lord Cobham, who was developing his great garden at Stowe in Buckinghamshire. And Brown joined him as head gardener in March 1741 at a salary of £25 with £10 for housing. He worked with Cobham particularly on the Grecian Valley, which is, incidentally, currently being repopulated with its Grecian, in quotes, statues by the National Trust. So it's going to look, in a year or two's time, much more like its original Brownian design, but that's what it looks like at the moment. Brown wasn't actually responsible for very much of the Stowe landscape. He's often credited with the Stowe landscape, but actually he didn't do very much to it apart from the Grecian Valley. But he certainly built his reputation there and then enhanced it by other commissions, such as that at Croome Court, where he built for Lord Coventry the house as well as the gardens and the inevitable lake. In 1751, he left Stowe and set himself up as an independent landscape contractor in Hammersmith, which was the centre of the garden trade at the time, although Hackney was another big centre of the nursery industry at the period. The big nurseries were, for reasons which I don't have time to go into today, all round London, from which the plants were, of course, exported to the rest of the country. So it was appropriate for Brown to come to the centre of the garden trade, and during the next 30 years, on that basis, he became the greatest landscape designer and contractor in England. He's said to have worked for half the House of Lords. That was a much smaller body than it is in its rather bloated state today. And he became, after some difficulty and a great deal of lobbying, one of the royal gardeners under George III. He wasn't, like Henry Wise, the royal gardener, because there were several others, at least two of them, better paid. And he was in charge of palaces, Hampton Court in particular, and St James's, which were no longer being used by the royal family. He also worked, however, at Kew, which was much more of a favourite residence. He lived as one of the royal gardeners at Wilderness House at Hampton Court, which can still be seen, but on the basis of his increasing prosperity, he bought an estate at Fenstanton in Huntingdonshire for £13,000. He died in 1783. His will has often been quoted because it contains bequests of only £10,000. And it's sometimes been thought that this shows that he wasn't very successful financially. But the value of the residue of the estate isn't known, nor, and this is a common mistake, does it include the value of landed property, which doesn't get into the valuations of this kind. So it doesn't include, for example, the value of the house at Fenstanton. What can be calculated is the value of the contracts which Brown carried out between 1761 and 1783, and they come to the staggering sum of £320,000. His own income is likely, as I'll suggest later on, to have been at least 1/5 of that. And that explains how, from a salary of £25,000 in 1741, he could buy, in the 1760s, a house of £13,000. My third example takes us into the railway age. Joseph Paxton was born in Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire, now part of Milton Keynes, in 1803. And he was the 8th child of William Paxton, an agricultural labourer. He seems to have started work in the traditional way as a garden boy and then be apprenticed near his home before he moved in 1823 to London. His breakthrough, which he had achieved partially by lying about his age, was his appointment as a student gardener at the new experimental garden of the Horticultural Society of London, now the Royal Horticultural Society, in Chiswick. And the breakthrough really came when he met in the gardens the 6th Duke of Devonshire, the landlord of the Horticultural Society garden. All accounts suggest that the Duke was impressed with Paxton's intelligence and good manners. Apparently, the Duke was rather deaf, and Paxton took the trouble to speak loudly and distinctly. And this appealed so much to the Duke, the 6th Duke, that having not taken much interest in gardening, and therefore perhaps not being able to judge gardeners very well, he took the risk of appointing Paxton as head gardener at Chatsworth. His salary in 1826 was £70 a year. Chatsworth had been, from the end of the 17th century, one of the great gardens of England. And of course, Brown had worked there during the 18th century. But it was taken to new heights by the 6th Duke, aided and abetted by Paxton. In fact, the 6th Duke became so enthusiastic about gardening and so keen on plant collecting, and he organised a number of plant collecting expeditions, one of which led to the, unusually actually, to the death of the plant collectors. And he spent so much money on gardening and other matters that he ran into financial difficulties, And Paxton essentially became his chief advisor, financial and gardening advisor, rescuing him from near bankruptcy by selling off some of his estates. But Paxton's crowning achievement at Chatsworth was the Great Stove, an enormous greenhouse, the largest greenhouse ever built at that time. But equally notable, as you'll know if you've been to Chatsworth, were the rock gardens and, of course, the Emperor Fountain, built for a visit from the Tsar of Russia, which actually never took place. But it was actually one of the smaller greenhouses at Chatsworth which brought national fame to Paxton, since its design was the basis of the Crystal Palace, the scene of the 1851 Great Exhibition of All the Nations. Paxton then capitalised on the success and fame that the Crystal Palace brought him by developing a range of greenhouses for the masses, or at least for the middle classes, while he also designed other gardens and a number of public parks. He became increasingly involved in railway speculation and rich through it. He also was particularly keen to develop a railway to bring tourists to Chatsworth. Like so many great gardens, or from the 18th century onwards, the garden owners were perfectly happy to show off their gardens to tourists, and, as in Paxton's case, actually to encourage parties of tourists through Thomas Cook and other travel agents. But he was a man of many parts. He started the Gardener's Chronicle, and he went on to design great houses such as Mentmore and the Chateau de Ferrières for the Rothschild family. He organised the Army Works Corps during the Crimean War. He died in 1865, a Liberal MP, leaving about £180,000. Not bad for the eighth child of an agricultural labourer. So, how did Wise, Brown and Paxton do it? What were the secrets of their success, not only as garden designers but as entrepreneurs? All three came from what used to be described as relatively humble origins, but achieved international fame and fortune. Those are the questions I want to answer, but first, let me anticipate another question, which is how rich were they in terms that we can understand today? There are several ways of answering that question, and some produce odd results. For example, a recent and otherwise excellent biography, I think, of Brown calculates that his salary at Stowe of £25 in 1750 equates to 1741, actually, isn't it? Equates to £2,129 per annum today. That, of course, is way below the modern minimum wage, let alone the living wage, which George Osborne is bringing in. It's inconceivable that the head gardener of a garden as great as Stowe should have been paid so little. The problem is that conversion to modern money has been made using the retail price index. Now, that's fine for making short-term comparisons. The rule of thumb is it's probably about right for comparing things during one's own lifetime. But it's very misleading over longer periods. There are a number of other ways of making the conversion, but one of them, which I'll show you, is to use an index of gross domestic product per capita, and to compare things to average gross domestic product per capita. That captures not only price changes, which of course have been enormous since the 17th and 18th centuries, but also, more importantly, the growth and increasing complexity of our economy. So if one does that, one can see at the top right-hand corner that Henry Wise was extremely rich, that his fortune, even if it was only £100,000 rather than £200,000, can plausibly be equated to leaving £32 million today. Sorry, through that was the purchase of Warwick Priory. The amount at death is 300 million. Sorry, I've left out one line from the slide. Yes, he purchased Warwick Priory for about £10,000, which is the equivalent of about 32 million. At death, he left, let's say, £100,000, about 300 million in modern terms. Lancelot Brown, you could see the correct translation of his salary, probably about £60,000, much more plausible for the head gardener of one of the largest and most important gardens in the country. You can see the value of his contracts at nearly £750 million over the last 22 years of his life. The purchase of the Longstanton estate and the bequests at death, which, as I said, ignore the residue and the value of his estates, of around £20 million. And then Paxton, equally successful financially, quite a large salary when he went to Chatsworth, and a substantial bequests at death. Now, how did they all make so much money? For many of their biographers, the answer seems simple. They worked extremely hard. Brown was known for riding 50 or 60 miles a day, as George London, Wise's partner, had done before him, crisscrossing the country, overcoming mud, cold, and highwaymen, in order to design his schemes at different estates. More speculatively, it's said that they all did well because they came from sturdy working-class stock, which appealed to the aristocrats for whom they worked, who are said to have disdained the middle-class upstart Humphrey Repton, who was the immediate successor to Brown. This again is somewhat, I think, well, speculative to put it mildly, but also rather overstated. Brown was probably from what would now be called the lower middle classes. He certainly married the daughter of a very respectable county family, whose father was twice mayor of Boston, and his brother married the daughter of Brown's first employer, Sir William Lorraine. So I want to go behind these rather simple answers and look at what an entrepreneur does and what they did as entrepreneurs. In simple terms, an entrepreneur, it seems to me, does three things. He, and of course usually was he at this point, seizes an opportunity and seizes it to supply something that someone else wants. He organizes its production and he finances the project. So how did Wise, Brown and Paxton do these three things so successfully? First, what opportunity did they perceive? They're examples of new men in a new kind of world, developing in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. For millennia, the British economy and the economies of every country in the world had been dominated by agriculture. But there had been, and it's important to realize this, a gradual growth of manufacturing. And in fact, by 1700 in Britain, manufacturing provided employment for just over a third of the workforce. And less than half in 1700 was still employed on the land. That's important because this is all before what we think of as the cataclysmic change called the Industrial Revolution. The changes of the next 200 years, from 1700 to 1900, were indeed cataclysmic, but in a rather different way from what most of us have been taught. During the 1700s and 1800s, the making of things did become more important, but the really significant changes in employment were the collapse in agricultural employment and the rise of a new type of occupation, not growing or making things, but providing services, knowledge, and expertise. By the end of the 19th century, service occupations were as large as manufacturing and much larger than agriculture. And today, of course, well over 4 in 5 of us are employed in service occupations. So Wise, Brown, and Paxton, who are central in the developing service trade of gardening, saw an opportunity in this changing economy. They sold not food or manufactured goods, but rather their skills, their knowledge, and their experience. They weren't alone. Architects, civil engineers, lawyers, bankers, teachers, butlers, head gardeners did much the same, and we would now lump them all together as the professions and services. But professionals like manufacturers and farmers need someone to pay them. The genius of our gardening entrepreneurs was that they identified a market for their services and exploited it to their great profit. But who was willing to pay them to create and maintain gardens on a scale never before seen? At the end of the 17th and throughout the 18th century, one particularly important paymaster was the British taxpayer. This was not to create public parks or gardens, but to build and maintain the royal gardens, although some of them later became public parks and gardens. The success of Wise and his partner, George London, together with that of the Brompton Park Nursery, was built on William and Mary's and Anne's spending on the royal gardens. The money came from the civil list, the costs of the royal household and civil government, and it was administered by the Office of Works. And its archives can, of course, be found in the National Archives. In 1702, the Lords of the Treasury, whose leading members would later be called the Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the government, wrote to the Office of Works to express alarm. This was not at the King's religion, which of course had caused quite a lot of trouble in the past 2 decades, nor at any assertion of royal power, which had caused even greater trouble in the 1640s to 1660s, but at how much William was spending on his palaces and gardens, mostly at Hampton Court. And if you can see the small print here, or small writing here, you can see that King Charles II was spending, it was estimated, had spent £20,000 a year on his palaces and gardens, King James II £30,000 a year, and William was spending at the rate of £45,000 a year, mostly at Hampton Court. In modern terms, that adds up to about £5 billion over 40 years. Although we don't know exactly how much of this was spent on the gardens, it was probably between a quarter and a third, so somewhere between £1 and £2.5 billion in this period. No wonder that when Queen Anne came to the throne, she said that she was determined to restrain expenditure, particularly on gardens. However, the allure of garden building and the blandishments of Henry Wise meant that her resolution didn't last very long. In fact, when one takes into account the costs of the garden at Blenheim Palace, which was financed by the state as a present to the Duke of Marlborough from a grateful Queen and nation, the gratitude actually wore out a bit when the expenditure escalated. But if you take Blenheim into account, public expenditure on the gardens may actually have increased. This is the Wise garden at Blenheim. Those of you who know Blenheim will know how large the house is, and therefore it's interesting, that's here, to see the house in the context of the whole of the estate, of course, but particularly of this area, which is the parterre, and based, it is thought, on military bastions, and completely swept away by Brown only some 40 or 50 years later. Wise received for his work on the royal palaces as maintaining the royal gardens the modern equivalent of just under £5 million a year. That had to cover all the costs of keeping the lawns clipped, the gravel paths raked, etc. More troublesome were the fountains, which never worked very well in the flat landscape of the Thames Valley. And there was also the cost of feeding the wild animals in the menagerie and the cows who provided the butter for the royal slice of bread. We don't know how much profit Wise made on the contract, but one of his successors later in the century complained bitterly when he was offered a new contract which cut severely the profit of 33% which he'd been making. So if that's typical of the profits of the royal gardeners, Wise may have been clearing about £1.5 million in modern money or more each year. That didn't include all the extra works which he undertook for his royal patrons, and particularly because the plants for the new gardens were supplied by his own nursery, Brompton Park. Wise doesn't actually seem to have exploited this link. The suspicious Sir John Vanbrugh, who was in charge at this period under the Office of Works, checked Wise's prices carefully and reported that the Queen wasn't being charged more than any private citizen. But Wise certainly did make a great deal of money from his royal appointment, and so too did Brown. And that may explain why he and his powerful friends lobbied so assiduously for Brown to become a royal gardener. Between 1765 and 1783, he was paid £2,000 a year, about a total of about 35,000. In modern money, that's about 75 million. Unlike Wise, Brown doesn't seem to have been paid for any extra work. He was probably busy elsewhere. He's normally presented as a rather friendly character, but I have looked at his reaction to the complaint made by the Office of Works that the Hampton Court gardens weren't being properly maintained. He responds very sharply indeed. Other people spent a great deal of money on gardening. We know, for example, that Frederick, Prince of Wales, the son of George II, spent £17 million in modern money on his fashionable garden at Carlton House in the 1730s. And public expenditure contributed to gardens in other ways. One of Frederick's household, Charles Hamilton, financed what I actually think is the most beautiful garden in England at Painshill in Surrey, from his large stipend as clerk controller to Frederick. And other great garden owners benefited from positions in various royal households. So public expenditure was a very important factor in helping to make Wise and Brown individually rich. The same was true of Paxton, although in a rather different way. He didn't make money directly from the appointment to build the Crystal Palace because he waived his fee to keep the contract costs down. However, Prince Albert did later give him £5,000 or £5 million in modern money out of the profits of the Great Exhibition. So it was a good gamble on Paxton's part. Much less successful financially was Paxton's involvement with the aftermath when the building was re-erected in Sydenham, surrounded by the water gardens which Paxton designed and which were intended to emulate Versailles. They must have been very splendid. And the result was a design triumph, but a financial disaster, although not actually so much for Paxton as for the shareholders in the Crystal Palace Company. But the Crystal Palace was the springboard for Paxton's business, supplying greenhouses for the masses, just as the Royal Gardens had been for London and Wise. In this way, public expenditure was the catalyst, the pump primer for private enterprise and private profit. Wise and Brown benefited from their status as royal gardeners and the royal example helped to make them successful. They had to cope, of course, with changing fashions and capricious clients. Wise operated at the time of the transition from French to Dutch styles, and then to the beginnings of the landscape movement. Brown captured the landscape style and made it fashionable that most landowners competed to employ him, and then did what he told them. Only a few, such as the de Grey family at Wrest Park, another splendid garden in Bedfordshire, were able to resist him and kept the old 18th century, late 17th century canal. But his success with private clients was spectacular. Between 1761 and 1783, he worked for over 125. They included 7 dukes, 26 earls, 20 other peers, 19 knights or baronets, 2 generals, and a judge. And they're all listed in his account book. This slide shows the payments made by the Duke of Marlborough for work at Blenheim between 1764 to 1774, when he undid a great deal of the work of Henry Wise. This single ledger page is the only evidence we have of works costing just over £50 million in modern terms. Now, as I said, these entrepreneurs had to cope with changing fashion. It's really a fashion business, gardening. It's very much like haute couture. It demands large incomes and large willingness to spend. They therefore had to accommodate themselves to aristocratic fashions and persuade their clients of their expertise in spending large amounts of their money. Remember that Lancelot Brown got his name, Capability, from his ability quickly to assess the capabilities of a site, and that was an important aspect of his success. Capricious clients could, of course, lead to profit. Everyone knows that the worst thing you can do is to change the specification while builders are on site. In 1701, William III did just that. He'd initially ordered that the southern end of the Privy garden at Hampton Court, between the building and the Thames, be lowered by 8 feet so that he could see the river from the first floor rooms in the palace. And this was done in the winter of 1700 and 1701, and the Privy garden was fully planted and statues and fountains were placed in it. Then in 1701, William visited his rooms, climbed to the first floor, and discovered that he still couldn't see the Thames. So he ordered the whole garden should be lowered. This meant all the new plants, paths, and statues had to be removed, and 3 feet of soil taken from an area of 5 acres. That's actually quite small by the standards of these landscaping works. It involved removing and relaying the water pipes across the site, and remarkably, it was completed by November, and it cost, in modern terms, £4 million on top of the cost of the original works, and that is the view that William III has as a result of it. So, maintaining good relations with your clients and benefiting from their changes of mind seems to have been one of the great successes of the great secrets of the success of Wise, Brown, and Paxton. And there's plenty of evidence that these three had good relations with their clients, both as designers and as men. They were popular. They were good salesmen. They were able to spot and capitalize on opportunities in the market. But plenty of good salesmen have gone bankrupt. How did they make sure that their projects were carried out? So let me move to organizing the works. Here their strategies were different. Wise, as I've said, built on the successes of Brompton Park and his activities as a royal gardener. And this is the contract for Kensington Palace, one of his responsibilities. And you can see the very detailed account of what he had to do in order to fulfill this very large contract. Other parts of the contract specified what tools had to be supplied, very much like the contents of a potting shed today: spades, rakes, shears, wheelbarrows, together with a sort of engine to sprinkle the trees and plants. We don't know how many men Wise employed to carry out this contract. His predecessor, the Earl of Portland, had employed 72 gardeners to carry out this work at Kensington on only 17 acres, with 40 men and 10 women looking after the parterre and wilderness, and 20 men and women in the kitchen garden. And at Hampton Court under Portland, there were 80 gardeners in all, with a foreman and with a head gardener and foreman. And, of course, important functionaries such as a bowling green keeper, a rolling horse keeper, and a fixture in all great gardens, the mole catcher. Wise may have economised on some of these because his contract was half that of Portland's, but it's likely that most were still required. Now, managing a workforce of 72 or 80 people is a big task. It cannot have been easy. Nor can estimating for the value of the extra works that Wise was undertaking on top of his regular contract. And he also had to organise the subcontractors who apparently did a great deal of the large earth-moving works. Capability Brown carried this method of working even further. Although he must have employed a labour force directly at Hampton Court and St James's, his other projects were organised almost entirely through subcontractors. He assessed the work, the capabilities of the site, then commissioned a survey, and then the client could either employ his own estate staff or Brown would parcel out the work to subcontractors. The payments to the subcontractors appear in the ledgers of Brown's accounts with Drummond's Bank, but there's just a series of payments, tantalisingly, they can't be related specifically to any particular activity. But subcontracting was a very common way of organising matters in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Brown seems to have done it very effectively, and it was carried on into building the canals. They were built section by section by different subcontractors, essentially the same method that Brown had used. And the comparison with the canals is an important one because the great landscaping works undertaken by Brown in particular were just as complex as building canals. People sometimes think that Brown just dammed convenient streams to create his lakes, but far from it. At Blenheim, Brown's largest lake and over a mile long, the entire area was lined with layers of clay, later called puddled clay, working obviously from the bottom upwards. The lowest layer was the thickest at 1.2 metres, and the clay to the lower layers was mixed with lime to stop animals burrowing through it. There were then 7 further layers, each of them rammed down by gangs of men, each team working with a different type of hammer. The construction of the Cascade, the dam at the southern end of the lake, was even more complicated, given the weight of water which had to be held back and is concealed by this cascade. And it all took 4 years to complete. And this illustrates, as I said earlier on, the importance of water engineering. These gardeners were skilled water engineers, hydraulic engineers. Histories of canal building usually attribute the invention of puddled clay in lining and waterproofing canals to James Brindley, but this is nonsense. The garden builders were far ahead of the canal builders and building equally complex, if not more complex, constructions. Paxton, again, developed in his contracting skills when he left, or while he was at Chatsworth, but when he left Chatsworth, and then capitalised, as I said earlier, on his design of greenhouses to produce this range, or rather to allow others to produce on his behalf this range of greenhouses, not exactly for the million, unless you had very large gardens, you probably wouldn't be able to put that up, but to at least the middle classes of 19th century Britain. Finally, the success of these three entrepreneurs was partly that they could manage money. And that in some ways was the most difficult of all their tasks. The clients paid Wise, Brown, Paxton and their colleagues for, as I said, their knowledge and technical expertise and their skills in training and managing a large labour force. But they also had to disburse payments to these large numbers of subcontractors and sometimes direct employees, and they had to manage cash flow on a large scale. In the 1760s, for example, Brown's annual turnover averaged about £36 million in modern money. It's extraordinary, therefore, that there's no evidence that Brown used any accounting system more complicated than simply recording receipts and payments. If one goes to the estate, the accounts of the great estates, and there are lots of them all over the country in record offices, you see that people had, from the 17th century, been able to use double entry bookkeeping. But Brown doesn't. He simply records the receipts in his contract book and receipts and payments in his accounts at Drummond's Bank. And he mixes business transactions, this was perfectly normal at the time, with payments to his wife and other household expenses. What that meant is that there is actually, you can't, from that basis, estimate the costs of or return to capital expenditure. You can't calculate the costs or income associated with any individual project. Now, records disappear. It may be that Brown had some other means of keeping track of jobs, but they haven't survived. Wise, to go back 50 years, was certainly capable of estimating the costs of projects, costing millions of pounds in modern terms, down to the nearest farthing, and of defending such estimates from scrutiny by the Office of Works. The Office of Works often struck out some costs, but they left almost always the great majority intact. This is all recorded in the National Archives. So neither Brown nor Paxton neither Brown nor Wise, had anything that we would really recognise as cost or management accounting. How did they survive as entrepreneurs in such a situation of essentially ignorance about, or we would think ignorance about their businesses? Probably it was by hedging their bets or persuading their clients, at any rate, to let them have very high rates of profit. Successful 18th century enterprises, we know from other examples outside the gardening trade, have rates of profit which are very high by modern standards. When entrepreneurs got it right, as Wise, Brown and Paxton clearly did, this could make them, and did make them, really rich. Others got it wrong. Charles Bridgeman, Brown's predecessor, Wise's successor as royal gardener, died, and his widow engaged in a long, lengthy correspondence with the Office of Works and with Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, about his claims to payment, having been left, she alleged, in a state of destitution. So I think one of the ways that they made a lot of money was by getting a large profit. a profit which wasn't regarded, therefore, essentially at the time as excessive, but was sufficient to insure them against some of the risks of their trades. Brown's accounts are surprising in another way, because they show that at least from 1761, he was able to require payments in advance, presumably because he was so much in demand that he could pick and choose his clients and impose such a condition on them. This was extremely unusual. The British aristocracy in general had a terrible reputation for failing to pay their bills, and there are numerous accounts of small tradesmen being forced into bankruptcy and the debtor's prison because of no or very late payment of their bills by noble families. But Brown was sufficiently successful to avoid that. Wise's partner, George London, had adopted a different technique. One of the reasons why he was alleged to have spent 6 months of the year travelling the country was to collect the debts due to him and to Brompton Park. But Brown's ability to get payment up front must have done wonders for his management of cash flow. And he would also have benefited hugely in this respect, as Wise did, from the regular payments from the royal household. If you're engaged in this kind of business, having a regular flow of income of the kind that you could get from being a royal gardener must have been extremely helpful. So, to sum up, my three subjects, Wise, Brown and Paxton, were exceptional men. They weren't only gifted designers who could both visualize and then carry out complex works over vast areas of land. They had little conventional education, but they became expert in botany, in architecture, and in civil engineering. But they were also very successful entrepreneurs, able to spot opportunities in the market, capitalize on them, sell their services to demanding clients, organize large labor forces, and manage their money. Brown's achievements have lasted better. We can still see them, but otherwise I think it's difficult to judge between them in terms of their success. They were entrepreneurs of a new kind. They didn't build their reputation on agriculture or manufacturing, but on services. We're constantly told today that public expenditure is a burden on the hard-working taxpayer. But actually there are countless examples, and gardening is, I think, one of them, where public spending primed the pump of economic activity. It underwrote new industries. The World Wide Web is another example to bring it up to date. So when next you visit St James's Park or Kensington Gardens or Kew or the municipal parks around Britain which Paxton helped to build, think not only of their beauty, but of the way in which they exemplify great entrepreneurship, but also the power of public expenditure. Thank you very much.